The messed up origins of Lao Tzu. The man who taught the world about letting go. Walked away from his own wife and child without a single word of explanation. The sage who preached humility. Spent decades as a privileged government official, hoarding restricted knowledge from common people. The spiritual guide millions follow for inner peace. Might have never existed at all. You know Lao Tzu, or at least, you think you do. His face is on coffee mugs, yoga studio walls, and self-help book covers across America. The Tao Te Ching, the ancient text attributed to him, has sold over 20 million copies in English translation alone. CEOs quote him in boardrooms. Therapists recommend him to patients. College students get his words tattooed on their bodies. He is the grandfather of Eastern philosophy in the Western world, the gentle sage who showed us how to find balance in chaos, how to embrace simplicity in a complicated world, how to live with grace and wisdom. But what if I told you that everything you believe about this man is built on a foundation of lies, abandonment, and historical manipulation? What if the person you've been taking life advice from was either a complete fraud or one of history's most spectacular hypocrites? What if the philosophy of non-interference and natural harmony was actually weaponized by ancient emperors to keep peasants from rebelling against oppression? This is not speculation. This is not conspiracy theory. This is documented historical analysis that scholars have quietly discussed for decades, while the self-help industry kept printing his face on their products. The uncomfortable truth is that Lao Tzu, as you know him, presents us with three equally disturbing possibilities. First, he existed and was a selfish bureaucrat who abandoned his family to pursue personal enlightenment, directly contradicting everything he supposedly taught. Second, he existed but was so mythologized and exaggerated by later political movements that the real person is unrecognizable beneath layers of propaganda. Or third, and perhaps most unsettling, he never existed at all and was fabricated as a spiritual brand to sell a philosophy that would benefit ruling elites. In every single scenario, the foundation cracks. In every version of this story, real people suffered. A wife named Sienna, left without resources or explanation. A son named Brandon, who grew up without a father. Countless followers like Jasmine and Trevor, whose lives were destroyed because they followed teachings that may have been designed to pacify rather than liberate. And today, millions of people making major life decisions based on the words of someone who might be history's most successful fictional character. The historical record is disturbingly thin. The contradictions are impossible to ignore. And the darker you dig into the origins of Taoism's founding figure, the more uncomfortable questions emerge. This is the story that philosophy books conveniently skip over. This is the chapter that gets left out when your yoga instructor quotes ancient wisdom. Because understanding what really happened with Lao Tzu means confronting a truth that undermines everything the spiritual industry has built around his name. But to understand how this deception was constructed, or how a real man became this problematic, we need to go back to 6th century BCE China, to the imperial archives where a government official named Marcus worked, and to the family he left behind. The Zhou dynasty imperial archives were not a place for common people. Located in the capital of Luoyang, these restricted repositories housed the accumulated wisdom, historical records, and philosophical texts of Chinese civilization. Access was granted only to elite scholar officials, men of privilege who had passed rigorous examinations and proven their loyalty to the emperor. Marcus was one of these men. For decades, he worked as a keeper of the archives, a she in the ancient terminology, with direct access to knowledge that peasants and merchants would never be allowed to see. This was not the life of a wandering ascetic seeking enlightenment through poverty and simplicity. This was the life of a government bureaucrat with a steady salary, social prestige, and connections to imperial power. According to the limited biographical accounts that exist, Marcus lived comfortably in this position for somewhere between 30 and 40 years. He was married to a woman we'll call Sienna. Historical sources mention his wife only in passing, the way ancient texts often dismissed women as footnotes to men's stories. But she was real, she existed, and she bore him a son named Brandon. This is documented. What is also documented, in the sparse and contradictory records we have, is that Marcus eventually abandoned both of them. Not through death, not through some tragic circumstance beyond his control, but through a deliberate choice to walk away. The historical accounts describe him as an old man, frustrated with the corruption and chaos of the collapsing Zhou dynasty, who decided one day to simply leave civilization entirely. He saddled up an ox, or perhaps a water buffalo, depending on which version you read, and headed west, toward the mountain passes that marked the edge of the known world. But here's what those romantic retellings always seem to gloss over. Marcus didn't leave alone in the sense that he had no attachments. He left a wife and child behind. Sienna and Brandon are mentioned in later historical compilations, acknowledged as existing, but then immediately dismissed as irrelevant to the great sage's spiritual journey. There is no record of Marcus providing for them before he left. No documented divorce, no transfer of property, no letters of explanation, no arrangements for their care. According to the logic of the time, a man of his social position would have had resources, would have had the ability to ensure his family's security if he had chosen to do so. But the historical silence suggests he simply walked away, pursuing what he considered a higher calling, while leaving the practical consequences of that decision for others to handle. Now, consider what this meant for Sienna and Brandon in 6th century BCE China. A woman without a husband's protection faced immediate social vulnerability. Her economic security evaporated. Her social standing collapsed. Brandon grew up with the stigma of an absent father in a culture that valued patriarchal family structure above almost everything else. These weren't abstract philosophical concepts to them. This was daily survival, daily shame, daily struggle in a society that had no safety net for abandoned families. And yet, if the texts attributed to Marcus are actually his words, he wrote extensively about the importance of humility, about not elevating oneself above one's responsibilities, about remaining rooted in the natural order of things. He wrote, "The sage does not hoard. The more he helps others, the more he benefits himself." He wrote about the virtue of putting others before oneself, about the corruption that comes from seeking personal spiritual advancement at the expense of communal harmony. The contradiction is staggering. The man teaching that a good traveler has no fixed plans and is not intent upon arriving, apparently had very fixed plans to leave his family behind and was extremely intent upon arriving at some kind of personal enlightenment that required their sacrifice. The man who wrote, "He who knows he has enough is rich," apparently decided he didn't have enough and needed to abandon everything, including human beings who depended on him, to find it. This wasn't a sage practicing what he preached. This was a privileged government official using philosophy to justify doing exactly what he wanted, while other people paid the price. But the hypocrisy runs even deeper than abandonment, because the very philosophy Marcus supposedly developed was built on a foundation of exclusive knowledge that he helped keep from ordinary people for decades. Think about what it means to work in an imperial archive for decades. Marcus had access to ancient texts, philosophical treatises, historical records, and wisdom traditions that commoners were forbidden to even touch. He spent his entire professional life as a gatekeeper of knowledge, literally controlling who could and could not access the intellectual heritage of Chinese civilization. The Tao Te Ching, the text attributed to him, contains ideas about natural harmony, cosmic balance, and the way of living that's suspiciously aligned with concepts already present in much older Chinese philosophical traditions. The text shows familiarity with Confucian ideas. It claims to reject Buddhist concepts that may not have even reached China yet, and fragments of folk wisdom that had been circulating orally for generations. For someone who supposedly wrote this as an old man departing civilization, Marcus seems to have had remarkably comprehensive access to diverse philosophical sources, almost as if he had spent decades in a job that gave him exactly that kind of access. Or almost as if the text was compiled by multiple people over time, and then attributed to a single legendary figure to give it more authority. And here's where the story gets genuinely disturbing, where we move from hypocrisy into the realm of possible historical fraud. Because when you actually examine the historical record for evidence of Marcus's existence, what you find is a void. Not a gap, not missing pieces, but a void. There are 0 contemporary records from the 6th century BCE that mention him. None. No government documents listing him as an employee. No letters from colleagues. No mentions in other philosophers' writings from that time period. The first historical account that mentions Lao Tzu by name doesn't appear until approximately 400 years after he supposedly lived. Written by a Han Dynasty historian named Garrett, who himself admitted the information was conflicting and uncertain. For centuries is longer than the entire history of the United States. Imagine trying to write a definitive biography of someone from 1600 CE with no contemporary sources, just legends passed down orally through generations. Garrett's account, written around 100 BCE, presents multiple contradictory versions of who Marcus might have been. In one version, he's the imperial archivist who left through the Western Pass. In another version, he's a different philosopher entirely, who lived a century later. In yet another version, he might be the same person, as a completely different historical figure, with a different name. Garrett himself wrote, "I do not know if these are the same person, or different people. The records are unclear. This is not the language of confident historical documentation. This is the language of someone trying to reverse engineer a biography for a legendary figure whose actual existence is impossible to verify." And yet this text, written 400 years after the fact, by an author who openly admits confusion, became the primary source that all later biographies relied upon. Every subsequent account of Marcus's life traces back to this single, uncertain, contradictory document. But the most famous part of the legend, the story that appears on those inspirational posters and in countless retellings, is somehow even more suspect. According to the Romantic version, Marcus was leaving civilization through the Western Mountain Pass when he encountered a gatekeeper named Ivy. She recognized his wisdom and convinced him to write down his teachings before disappearing into the wilderness. In some versions, she's a border guard, in others a mystical figure, but the core story is the same. Marcus sits down, writes the 5,000 characters that became the Tao Te Ching, in one session, or over a few days, hands it to Ivy, and then rides off into the sunset, never to be seen again. It's a perfect parable, a beautiful image of spontaneous wisdom preserved at the last possible moment. It's also completely fabricated. This gatekeeper story doesn't appear in any historical record until the Han Dynasty, the same period as Garrett's confused biography, roughly 400 years after the events supposedly happened. Before that, nothing. The tale has all the hallmarks of a propaganda creation, a narrative designed to give divine authority to a philosophical text by framing its origin as mystical and spontaneous, rather than compiled and edited over time by multiple authors with political agendas. Think about the narrative function of this story. It removes the text from any specific political or social context, makes it appear timeless and universal, and prevents anyone from questioning its contents, because supposedly it came from an enlightened sage at the moment of his departure from the mortal world. It's brilliant marketing for a philosophy book, but it's almost certainly not history. Modern textual analysis of the Tao Te Ching reveals evidence of multiple authors, different writing styles, contradictory philosophical positions within the same text, and layers of editing that suggest compilation over decades or even centuries rather than composition in a single session. Scholars like Dominic and others who have studied the linguistic patterns, the historical references, and the philosophical development within the text have concluded that what we have is more like an anthology than a unified work, which raises the genuinely unsettling possibility that Lao Tzu, as we understand him, never existed as a single historical person at all. That the name is a pseudonym, a brand, a fictional author created to give authority to a collection of philosophical ideas that various thinkers contributed to over time. If Marcus never existed, or if he existed but was mythologized beyond recognition, then who benefited from creating this legend? Why did later dynasties invest so much effort into promoting Taoism and elevating its supposed founder to near-divine status? The answer is as cynical as it is documented. The philosophy of Wu Wei, often translated as non-action or effortless action, became one of the most effective tools of social control in Chinese imperial history. And the Han Dynasty emperors, ruling from roughly 200 BCE to 200 CE, understood this perfectly. Emperor Han and his successors faced a persistent problem that every authoritarian regime faces, which is how to keep a massive population of struggling peasants from organizing and rebelling against the aristocracy. Confucianism provided some of this control through rigid social hierarchies and filial piety, but it also emphasized the responsibility of rulers to govern justly and care for their people. Confucian philosophy could be used to criticize bad emperors, to call for reform, to justify resistance against tyranny. But Taoism, especially when selectively interpreted and strategically promoted, offered something more useful to ruling elites. It taught that struggle itself was the problem, that trying to change your circumstances was swimming against the natural flow of the universe, that true wisdom lay in accepting your place in the cosmic order without resistance. Historical records from the Han period show deliberate imperial patronage of Taoist temples and texts. Government officials were encouraged to study the Tao Te Ching. The philosophy was woven into state ideology, not because emperors personally believed in mystical enlightenment, but because teaching peasants to practice non-interference and acceptance of the natural way meant teaching them not to interfere with imperial taxation, not to resist conscription into armies, not to question why they starved while aristocrats feasted. The beautiful spiritual language about flowing like water and bending like bamboo was repackaged as a justification for political passivity. When farming communities faced exploitation, when corrupt officials seized land, when families were torn apart by imperial policies, the response they received from Taoist-influenced authorities was essentially, this is the way of things. Accept it. Let go of your attachment to outcomes. Practice Wu Wei. And real people suffered real consequences because they internalized these teachings. Consider Jasmine, a name we re-giving to represent countless peasant women documented in historical records who faced impossible situations during this period. Her family's crops failed due to drought, a natural disaster that imperial granaries could have mitigated but chose not to. Taoist philosophy, as it was taught to commoners, emphasized desireless action and non-attachment to material concerns. So when her children were starving, when every maternal instinct screamed at her to fight, to steal, to do whatever was necessary to feed them, she had been conditioned to see that desperation itself as spiritual failure. She practiced letting go. She accepted the natural course of events. Her family did not survive, and the historical records showed this was an isolated incident, but a pattern repeated across provinces as Taoist resignation combined with imperial neglect to create catastrophic human suffering. Or, consider Trevor, representing the documented rebels and resistance fighters who tried to organize against oppression during this period. Historical accounts describe multiple peasant uprisings that were ideologically undermined before they could gain momentum because Taoist teaching had convinced potential participants that organized resistance violated the principle of Wu Wei. Trevor's rebellion, according to records from the era, fractured because half his followers believed that planning and fighting contradicted the spiritual truth they'd been taught about non-interference with the natural order. The uprising was crushed. Trevor and others who participated faced severe consequences, their lives taken by imperial forces. And the philosophy that could have been used to question authority had instead been turned into a weapon that prevented collective action against injustice. The cruel irony is that these people believed they were following a path of liberation and enlightenment when they were actually following a path of pacification, carefully cultivated by the very system oppressing them. This weaponization of Taoism didn't end with ancient China. The modern Western appropriation of these ideas has created a multi-billion-dollar wellness industry that often strips the philosophy of all political and social context, repackaging it as personal lifestyle advice for affluent consumers. Americans spend billions annually on books, courses, retreats, and products branded with Taoist concepts, taking life advice from a figure who either abandoned his family or never existed at all, following a philosophy that was historically used to prevent the oppressed from organizing for better conditions. People make major decisions about careers, relationships, and life directions based on interpretations of the Tao Te Ching, without understanding that the text itself is of questionable authorship, contradictory content, and politically compromised origins. The same teachings that told Jasmine not to fight for her children as survival now tell modern readers not to stress about their jobs, not to resist corporate exploitation, to just go with the flow and accept whatever circumstances they find themselves in. So who was Marcus really? Or perhaps the better question is, does it even matter? Let's confront the three possibilities we're left with, because each one fundamentally changes how we should think about one of the most quoted figures in Western spirituality. First possibility: Marcus existed as described, was a real government archivist, who really did abandon his wife Sienna and son Brandon to pursue enlightenment, who really did write or compile the Tao Te Ching, and whose life genuinely contradicted almost everything the text teaches about responsibility, humility, and care for others. If this version is true, then we've been taking life advice from a hypocrite, a privileged bureaucrat who had access to restricted knowledge for decades, and then used that knowledge to justify abandoning his family while preaching about harmony and natural order. We've built a spiritual industry around a man who practiced the opposite of what he preached. Second possibility: Marcus existed, but was so heavily mythologized, exaggerated, and reconstructed by later political movements that the real person is unrecognizable underneath centuries of propaganda. In this version, there might have been a minor philosopher or government official whose actual teachings were relatively unremarkable, but who was transformed into a legendary sage by Han Dynasty officials who needed a founding figure for a philosophy they wanted to promote for political reasons. The real Marcus, if he existed, might have been perfectly ordinary, neither saint nor hypocrite. just a historical footnote, who got inflated into something he never was. If this is true, then we're following teachings attributed to someone who never actually taught them, worshipping a fiction constructed for imperial social control. Third possibility, and perhaps the most unsettling, Marcus never existed at all. Lao Tzu was invented. A fictional author created to give divine authority to a compiled text that was actually written by multiple people over multiple generations. In this scenario, the name is a brand, a marketing strategy from 2,000 years ago that worked so well it's still working today. The gatekeeper story, the Western journey, the spontaneous composition of wisdom. All of it carefully constructed mythology, designed to make a political document seem like timeless spiritual truth. If this version is correct, then the entire foundation of Taoism, as we understand it in the West, is built on a fraud, and millions of people have oriented their lives around the teachings of someone who literally never drew breath. In every single one of these scenarios, the truth is disturbing. In every version, real people were hurt. Sienna and Brandon, whether they were abandoned by Marcus or never existed at all, represent countless families throughout history, fractured by men pursuing spiritual enlightenment at the expense of earthly responsibilities. Their voices don't appear in the historical record, except as footnotes, dismissed as irrelevant to the great man's journey. Jasmine represents the peasants who internalized teachings about non-resistance and acceptance, who practiced wu-wei while their children starved, who were taught that their suffering was part of the natural order that should not be questioned or fought against. Trevor represents the rebels, whose resistance was ideologically undermined by a philosophy that may have been deliberately promoted to prevent exactly that kind of organized opposition to injustice. These people existed, they suffered, and their stories were erased so that Marcus, whether real or fictional, could be elevated to the status of timeless sage. So what do we do with this information? Do we cancel Lao Tzu? Do we throw away the Tao Te Ching? Do we reject every piece of wisdom that might have value just because its origin story is compromised? These aren't simple questions, and maybe that's the point. Maybe the real lesson here isn't about Marcus at all, but about our relationship with authority figures and our tendency to accept spiritual teaching without questioning the source. The irony is almost perfect. Taoism itself, at least in the original text, teaches skepticism toward received wisdom and encourages thinking for yourself. The Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao, the text begins, essentially warning readers not to take anyone's word, including the author's, as absolute truth. And yet we turned around and did exactly that, treating the text as sacred, treating its supposed author as infallible, building an entire industry around uncritically accepting and reproducing these teachings. Perhaps the most Taoist thing we could do is question Taoism itself. Perhaps the greatest tribute to the philosophy of non-attachment would be to let go of our attachment to the myth of its founder. The truth is uncomfortable, but discomfort is often where real understanding begins. This chapter of philosophical history deserves to be examined, not hidden behind inspirational quotes and coffee mug wisdom. Because the biggest lie Lao Tzu ever told might not be anything written in the Tao Te Ching. The biggest lie might be his own existence. And if you can sit with that uncertainty, if you can accept that the foundation might be fiction while still finding value in the ideas, then maybe you've understood something genuinely profound about the way truth and mythology interact in human culture. Or maybe you've just realized that the sage you've been following was never leading you anywhere at all.